Bom dia a todos. É um prazer estar aqui e encontrando colegas e estudantes, mesmo que à distância, mesmo que dessa forma virtual. Eu gostaria muito de agradecer a presença de todos e nós vamos dar início ao nosso evento. É um evento que está programado para hoje, amanhã e sexta. Vocês têm acesso ao programa na página do Laboratório de Estudos do Romance no Facebook. E eu tenho um enorme prazer de apresentar para vocês o professor Phillip Wegner, da Universidade da Flórida, que vai fazer a palestra de abertura do nosso evento. Eu vou apresentá-lo em inglês, né, para que ele não se sinta tão, enfim, distante de nós. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to receive Professor Phillip Wegner in our conference, I should say, online conference, and I'm going to introduce him to you. But before I do that, I would really like to thank him for accepting our invitation. I know that we are all very busy with our, sort of regular activities, and it's really, a pleasure to be able to share his ideas with everybody. The laboratory has been organizing these events online, and so this is one of the ways we can bring specialists to talk about, let's say, topics that are of general interest. And I suppose that science fiction is one of those topics that arises a lot of curiosity, attention, and interest for all of us. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce then Professor Phillip Wegner, who is the Master Neubauer Eminent Scholar and Professor of English at the University of Florida, where he has been teaching since 1994. He's also the director of the Working Group for the Study of Critical Theory. He's the author of a variety of essays, of numerous essays, and 5 books, which I'm going to mention. Imaginary Communities, Utopia, The Nation, and the Spatial Histories of Modernity, published in 2002. Life Between Two Deaths, U.S. Culture, 1989 to 2001, published in 2009. Periodizing Jameson, Dialectics, University and the Desire for Narrative, published in 2014. Shockwaves of Possibility, Essays on Science Fiction, Globalization and Utopia, of 2014. And most recently, Invoking Hope, Theory and Utopia in Dark Times, 2020, very recent indeed. He's also the editor of a new edition of Robert C. Elliott's The Shape of Utopia, Studies in a Literary Genre, published in 2013. And the good news is that he has just completed a new book entitled The Jameson Files, which is going to come out soon, we hope. And he's currently working on a study of the diverse cultural productions released in the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Miracles, that was 1984. In 2017, Professor Wegner was honored with the North American Society for Utopian Studies Lemon-Tower Sargent Award for Distinguished Scholarship. A full biography and list of publications can be found at his own site, which is philipwegner.org. Okay, so thanks very much again, Professor Phillip. So sorry, the introduction was long, sort of long, but I mean, after having produced so much, having published so much, then we had to mention all of that. So thanks again. And the floor is all yours now. I'm going to disappear, okay?
Okay, a very generous introduction. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I hope we can have a wonderful and productive conversation. The paper is a little bit on the longer side, but hopefully we will have lots of time for conversation today. So let me begin again today by first offering my thanks to the organizers of this conference, and especially to Julia Braga Neves for your interest in my work and for your generous invitation to speak at this event. It is an honor to be following my and Rob Talley's teacher, Frederick Jameson, as a keynote speaker here. I would also like to express my gratitude to my mentor and dear friend Tom Moylan for suggesting my name to all of you. And I want to thank you too for giving me the motivation to tackle this paper at this time, because as I was working on it, an issue I've been exploring in various ways over the course of my last few books came into much sharper focus. It concerns the differences between the work of the cultural critic and that of the scholar, the latter being understood in Max Weber's sense of scholarship or science as vocation, Wissenschaft als Beruf. I would now maintain that the critic, be it some of the professional literary critics I discuss in this paper or the contemporary critics of theoretical work that I take on in my forthcoming book, The Jameson Files, aims to reproduce an already existing status quo by establishing an orthodox catechism concerning how you do something, writing or reading in this case, and an index of works that should not be encountered. The scholar, on the other hand, strives to break apart any such enclosure by encouraging their students or readers to encounter new things in the hopes of enabling them to do the same in their future vocation and for future generations. As Thomas A. Carlson aptly put it in his discussion of Weber's essay, quote, teaching then would it be itself a work of passion that awakens the student potentially to her own distinctive passions. The critic is oriented then toward preserving what already exists, the scholar toward engendering the new. This is a lesson I took from my own great scholar teachers such as Jameson and Moylan, and it is in this spirit that I share these thoughts with you today. Now, when I received Julia's invitation late last March, I read with great interest the description of the conference as being organized to honor the centenary of one of the greatest North American writers of the 20th century, Kurt Vonnegut, by taking up the theme of, quote, the severing of connections among human beings and of humankind with the world in the face of catastrophe, as well as its impact in on the contemporary production of science fiction. The proposal then further points out, quote, through the latter half of the 20th century and first decades of the 21st century, the ways in which human beings relate to one another and to the planet took new turns with the aggravation of the environmental crisis, the consolidation of neoliberalism, and the emergence of new technologies and means of communication, such as the internet and social media. It then concludes with the expressed desire for this conference, quote, to promote debates about the ways in which science fiction, and especially what Darko Suvin refers to as its socio-political subgenres of utopia and dystopia, represent isolation, loneliness, and disaffection of humankind within the context of contemporary crises, while they also urge the speculation of new possible worlds that can exist beyond catastrophe. Now, upon reading this wonderful statement, I quickly became convinced that the work of a few contemporary writers would better fit this rich and multi-pronged agenda than that of the Japanese-British author and 2017 Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro. Let's see. Good. Ishiguro was on my mind at that moment because only a few months prior, I had read Klara and the Sun, his 2020 one novel, his most recent work, and his first since winning the Nobel Prize. And I was stunned to see how much the events in the novel paralleled some of those in my life at that time. Klara and the Sun is also the first novel by Ishiguro that explicitly takes the classical form of a dystopia, a literary fiction that, as the great bibliographer and scholar of utopia and dystopia already mentioned today, Lyman Tower Sargent, defines it. The Utopia presents, quote, a non-existent society described in considerable detail and normally located in time and space that the author intended a contemporaneous reader to view as considerably worse than the society to which the reader lived. Now, I've argued in the past, to cite myself here, that the dystopian narrative is the most significant subgenre of the novel form to emerge from Great Britain in the last century. My first encounter with Ishiguro's work, in fact, came when I was asked in the spring of 2012 by the editors of the Blackwell Companion to British Literature to write an essay on the British dystopian novel from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine to Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go in 2005. In the Modern Library 1998 list of the 100 best novels written in English and published in the 20th century, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World from 1932, George Orwell's 1984 from 1949, William Golding's Lord of the Flies from 1954, and Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange from 1962 all appear in the top 65. Brave New World, in the 5th slot, is the highest rated novel by a non-Irish or American author. All 4 appear again in Radcliffe Rivals' 100 Best Novels, The Lord of the Flies, 1984, and Brave New World at the 8th, 9th, and 16th places, respectively, again being the highest ranked works of British fiction on the list. Finally, making the list of Time Magazine's 100 best English language novels published between 1923 and 2005, again are 1984, Lord of the Flies, and A Clockwork Orange, with the additions of Never Let Me Go and Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen from 1987, the only graphic novel so honored. While such lists are no indications of literary merit, they do attest to the continued power and interest of the dystopian form. Now, Klara and the Sun very much continues in the tradition of these earlier British writers. Ishiguro's novel is set in the near future United States, where humanoid artificial intelligences have taken up a prominent place in an advanced postmodern or neoliberal economy. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri argue that, quote, in our times, modernization has come to an end. In other words, industrial production is no longer expanding its dominance over other economic forms and social phenomenon. A symptom of this shift is manifest in the quantitative changes in employment, whereas the process of modernization was indicated by a migration of labor from agriculture and mining, the primary sector, to industry, the secondary. The process of post-modernization or informationization has been demonstrated through the migration from industry to surface jobs, the tertiary. A shift, in a point very well worth underscoring, that has taken place in the dominant capitalist countries, and particularly in the United States, since the early 1970s. Services cover a wide range of activities from healthcare, education, and finance to transportation, entertainment, and advertising. The jobs, for the most part, are highly mobile and involve flexible skills. More important, they are characterized in general by the central role played by knowledge, information, affect, and communication. In this sense, many call the post-industrial economy an informational economy. Now, following in the footsteps of some of the founding texts of the modern dystopia, Jack London's The Iron Heel from 1908, E.M. Forster's short story The Machine Stops from 1909, and Evgeny Zamyatin's We from 1921, Klara and the Sun is narrated in the first person by Klara, an artificial friend, or AF android. As in London's, Forster's, and Zamyatin's pioneering fictions, Klara is a lifelong inhabitant of this society and one whose labor is integral to its neoliberal service economy. Given Klara's narrow perspective, indeed, in the novel's opening section, her entire understanding of the world is limited to what she can observe through her department store window, her interactions with the store's small and elite clientele, and an occasional perusal of magazines. Ishiguro forces his readers to slowly build a picture of the novel's non-existent society through fragments of conversation overheard by Klara and other details of the world she observes. Now, Klara is an artificial intelligence. An android deserved to serve as a companion for upper middle class children who, in this near future world, are educated exclusively online and in their homes by private tutors. As a result, these children have, until their university years, almost no contact with others outside of their immediate family, and those they meet in highly formalized interaction meetings, which take place in their homes and with their accompanying adults, all of them female, nearby and on occasion intervening in their exchanges. The children are then given social interaction scores, which, along with their formal education, are considered as part of their application to continue to the small handful of remaining elite universities. Now, early in the novel, one such meeting takes place in the spacious home located on the outskirts of a major never-named city of Klara's eventual owner and another of the novel's central characters, 14-year-old Josie. This meeting is also attended by the only child of her own age with whom Josie is in regular contact, her neighbor Rick. Rick lives with his mother, Helen, a retired British actress and widow who suffers from extended bouts of mental illness. As a result, Rick and Helen's household and economic prospects have declined precipitously. In a plot line that recalls Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the two teenagers plan to bridge their social differences by, upon the completion of their university educations, getting married. Now, Josie's mother, Chrissy, is a highly paid corporate lawyer who commutes to the city for work and hence can afford to spend little time at home with her daughter. Josie's father, Paul, is an engineer, formerly employed at a nearby chemical plant, Kimball Refrigeration, although through Klara, the reader learns that, quote, they haven't had anything to do with refrigeration for decades. However, a number of years earlier, Paul was substituted, like all the rest of them, his role in the firm taken over by other android AIs. This, we later learn, has led to wide-scale unemployment. Klara overhears these words from a protester who confronts Josie's mother during a family trip into the city. Quote, "We're protesting the proposal to clear the Oxford building. There's currently 423 post-employed people living inside it, 86 of them children. Neither Lexdale Corporation nor the city have offered any reasonable plan regarding their relocation," end of the quote, and as well as a growing animosity towards all AIs. During the same trip, a woman accosts Josie outside a theater asking her, "So this is your machine?" When Josie confirms, quote, "Klara's my AF, if that's what you're asking," the woman blurts out, quote, "First they take the jobs, then they take the seats at the theater." As a result of Paul's unemployment and the death a few years earlier of Josie's older sister, Sal, the girl's parents are divorced, and thus the only inhabitants of her home with whom Josie interacts on a daily basis are her mother, Klara, and a foreign-born live-in housekeeper, Melania. Now, while Klara and the Sun is the only one of Ishiguro's novels to take the form of a classical dystopia, I want to argue that his other two most celebrated novels, here we picture all of them, the realist historical novel The Remains of the Day, published in 1988, and the science fiction alternate history Never Let Me Go from 2005, also draw on key elements of the dystopian tradition, thereby locating their imagined bad places, respectively, in the recent past, alternate present, and a possible near future. All three novels are also linked in that they deploy a limited first-person perspective, something Ishiguro departs from for only for the first time in his novel published between Never Let Me Go and Klara and the Sun, the Tolkien-esque fantasy, The Buried Giant from 2015. Now, however, to describe these three novels as dystopia raises a very interesting question. To what degree are the worlds portrayed in them considerably worse than the society in which their readers currently inhabit? I would maintain that this is most the case in the novel that otherwise appears to be at the least a dystopia, the historical novel The Remains of the Day. Although keep in mind that Jameson posits a direct continuity between the 19th century historical novel and 20th century science fiction. However, even in Remains, the dystopian past of the English 1930s is far worse in regards to the British welfare state that emerges after the conclusion of the global crisis of the Second World War, and not to the neoliberal regime that is coming into being in the decades after the elections in Great Britain of Margaret Thatcher and in the United States of Ronald Reagan, two of the chief architects of our contemporary global dystopia. The alternate reality of Never Let Me Go's England, late 1990s, a world in which the 1970s breakthroughs in cloning have been developed such that the society breeds human clones who, upon achieving adulthood, have their organs harvested until they complete or die from these painful and repeated procedures. While clearly different from Great Britain's empirical present, is in fact, I will argue momentarily, no worse than it. In this way, the past, alternate, and future societies found in these three novels become critical, estranging allegories of their respective contemporary situations. The same can be said of The Buried Giant, which allegorically explores state violence and collective memory, but I will largely leave this novel aside in my talk today. Now, read in this way, the publication dates of each novels, 1988, 2005, and 2021, locates them squarely within each of the three different moments making up William Davies' 2016 periodization of neoliberalism. Davies names these moments combative neoliberalism, 1979 to 1989, normative neoliberalism, 1989 to 2008, and punitive neoliberalism, 2008 to an unspecified future. Each of Ishiguro's dystopias experiments can thus be understood as forms of what Jameson terms symbolic acts. The symbolic act therefore begins by generating and producing its own context in the same moment of emergence in which it steps back from it, taking its measure with a view towards its own projects of transformation, end of the quote. And I've actually, will put the entire long quote because of its significance for what I'm going to be talking about here today, but not read any further from it. As symbolic acts, then, Ishiguro's three novels, when read in conjunction, develop an effective presentation of the lived realities of neoliberalism's changing histories. Now, the October 5th, 2017 press release of the Swedish Academy's permanent secretary announcing Ishiguro's Nobel Prize describes him as a writer, quote, who in novels of great emotional force has uncovered the abyss beneath our illusory sense of connection with the world, end of the quote. Now, as an aside, allow me to note that the Academy's permanent secretary at the time was my friend, fellow graduate of Duke's graduate program in literature, and also a student of Jameson, Sara Danius. And here is Sara at the 2000 presentation or announcement of Ishiguro's award. Now, Sara was appointed in 2015 as the Academy's first female permanent secretary. During a subsequent set of controversies the year following Ishiguro's award, she was forced to resign from the position, and she passed away on October 12, 2019, at the young age of 57. I dedicate this essay then to her memory and an acknowledgement of the extraordinary scholarly work she did to open our notions of what constitutes world letters. Now, I would refine this insight a bit further and argue that in his three great dystopias, Ishiguro gives expression to the corrosive effects of neoliberalism's competitive individualism on the connections between people. If a year before the publication of Remains of the Day, Thatcher could infamously proclaim, quote, "There's no such thing as society, there are individual men and women, and there are families," and for a superb dystopian literalization of Thatcher's statement, I strongly recommend reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road from 2006. By the time we reach our own moment, neoliberalism threatens to dissolve even the bonds of what Thatcher narrowly conceives of as biological families. Klara and the Sun focuses in particular on the undermining of the bonds across generations produced by increasingly desperate and ultimately ineffective efforts to reproduce within the moment of Davies' punitive neoliberalism an upper middle class status quo. A project I now realize I too was very much involved in when I first read the novel. Now, as Louis Althusser long ago taught us, one of the major vehicles of such social reproduction is located in the ideological state apparatus, or ISAs, of education. What Ishiguro's novel helps us effectively grasp then is that such a reproduction is less a matter of content of the education than its very institutional or form. And I'll return to this issue again near the conclusion of my talk. Now, there has been a number of discussions suggesting the connection between the work of Ishiguro and Vonnegut. For example, upon the announcement of the Nobel Prize, Jean-Luc Bouchard observed, quote, "To read Ishiguro is to read weirdness, presented in a beautiful literary package. He's far from being the first author to successfully achieve this balance. He stands side by side giants such as Lydia Davis, Octavia Butler, Margaret Atwood, Franz Kafka, and Kurt Vonnegut. Yet he is one of the sharpest at sustaining masteries over both elements. And by winning the Nobel Prize, he may continue to inspire generations of speculative writers for years to come." End of the quote. Now, among the eminently deserving finalists for the award in 2017 were also Atwood, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Haruki Murakami. I am sad to report that in the 4 awards since, and all following the resignation of Donius, none of these writers have yet received it. Now, Murakami lists Vonnegut alongside Raymond Chandler and Richard Brautigan as among the writers who most influenced him. And when asked in a 2014 Guardian story, quote, to name some of his favorite writers working today, Murakami enthuses about Kazuo Ishiguro. I think he dedicates himself to writing. When he's not writing, he goes around the world, but when he's writing, he goes nowhere. Cormac McCarthy, always riveting, and the Norwegian novelist Dag Solstad, whom he is currently translating into Japanese from English. He's a kind of surrealistic writer, very strange novels. I think that's serious literature. Now, when Ishiguro's Nobel Prize was first announced, USA Today's London-based world affairs correspondent Kim Hjelmsjord asserted, quote, "Ishiguro's win will be viewed by many in the publishing world as a relatively safe choice by the Academy after last year. In one of the most surprising decisions in the prize's history, American singer and poet Bob Dylan was awarded the prestigious accolade." Another website put the matter even more bluntly. Quote, "The choice of Dylan for the award was divisive, with many disputing his credentials as a poet." Now, I disagree with Hjelmsjord and believe that far too many in the contemporary literary critical establishment, or at least those in North America and Great Britain, would find the choice of Ishiguro equally surprising, divisive, and open to disputation. Moreover, I now suspect that the choice of the three winners during Danius's tenure as permanent secretary, Ishiguro, Dylan, and before them, the Belarusian investigative journalist Svetlana Alexievich, contributed significantly to the attacks on Danius's leadership. Now, the reasons why this might be the case have been made amply evident in the last decade by two prominent critics. In 2011, the Belfast-based British critic John Self, whose name, unfortunately, is also the same as that of the narrator of Martin Amis's Money from 1984, in a Guardian article with the audacious title Famous for the Wrong Book, and which opens with the claim, quote, "Why is it that the book for which an author is best known is rarely their best? It's not, I hope, the simple snobbery of insisting that most popular can't be the finest," opines of Ishiguro's work, quote, "Hard to say exactly which book is his most famous these days. Is it the baffling, the incoherent Never Let Me Go, probably his weakest novel, or the reliable The Remains of the Day, a lovely book to be sure, but really just a refinement of his first two novels?" According to Self, then, quote, "The big one surely is Ishiguro's The Unconsoled." Now, in the same article, Self proclaims Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five rubbish, a claim I will leave to our other two keynotes to respond. Now, similarly, Harvard's professor of the practice of literary criticism, James Wood, exclaims in a New Yorker review that in The Buried Giant, Ishiguro, quote, "has written not a novel about historical amnesia, but an allegory of historical amnesia, set in a 6th or 7th century Britain, amuck with dragons, ogres, and Arthurian knights. The problem is not fantasy, but allegory, which exists to literalize and simplify. The giant is not buried deeply enough." End of the quote. Wood then revealingly writes, quote, "So allegory is anti-novelistic because it points away from its own story toward another story. Curiously, and despite its reputation, allegory is not suggestive. It is literal." End of the quote. Now, this is similar to Wood's attack a year earlier on David Mitchell's fiction, about which I've written extensively, which in Wood's view is symptomatic of a larger deleterious development in contemporary life. Quote, "As the novel's cultural centrality dims, so storytelling, J.K. Rowling's magical owl of Minerva, equipped for 1,000 tricks and turns, flies up and fills the air. Meaning is a bit of a bore, but storytelling is alive. What becomes harder to find and lonelier to defend is the idea of the novel as, in Ford Madoc Ford's words, a medium of profoundly serious investigation into the human case." End of the quote. I seem misplaced one of my pages. I apologize for the moment here. Excuse me. I'll read momentarily here from the electronic document. Okay. What becomes evident here is that the link between writers like Ishiguro and Murakami, Vonnegut, Atwood, Noguchi, Chandler, Brautigan, McCarthy, Solstad, and Mitchell lies in the challenge they offer to dominant notions of aesthetic value. All these writers violate the Henry Jamesian norms for proper novelistic fiction as defined by the post-war institutionalization of literary production that Mark McGurl so powerfully captures in the US context in his landmark analysis of the Master of Fine Arts program era. Now, I would also strongly recommend Jameson's astute reading of and building upon McGurl's work in order to create a place in his story for South American magical realism. Now, such a normative notion of the novel involves at once a clear separation of genre from serious literature, a late modernist depoliticization of the novelist aesthetic, and a distancing of the work's events from the social and political concerns of its moment. Now, in a revealing turn, Wood, unlike Self, describes Never Let Me Go as a, quote, miraculous novel because it is an allegory that points straight at us. However, this is because for Wood, its lessons turn out to unfold in terms of the most abstract humanist ideology. Quote, the lives of the cloned children who fall in love and read novels and bicker at school just as ordinary kids do seem like parodies of real freedom, of real existence, because we know what will happen to them not long after they leave school. But perhaps our own lives are mere parodies of real freedom, of real existence. Life is a death sentence, whether you die at 20 or 80. Now, Wood's claims here recall for me a scene in Michelle Cliff's extraordinary and underappreciated novel, Free Enterprise, a novel of Mary Ellen Pleasant, first published in 1993. Pleasant was a real-world former slave who, among her other accomplishments, worked on the Underground Railroad, serves as a major financial supporter of John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, the event that triggered the U.S. Civil War, and she requested that her tombstone read simply, "She was a friend of John Brown," and later spearheaded a series of landmark lawsuits that resulted in the California State Supreme Court ruling that segregation on streetcars was illegal. Now, in the scene of interest to me, Pleasant entails the unveiling in Boston of J.M.W. Turner's monumental 1840 painting, Slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. And this explains the background in my previous slides. You can still view this painting in Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. Now, when the real-world owner of the painting, the wealthy Boston socialite Alice Sturgis Hooper, writes a letter describing her reading of the painting as attending first and foremost to the white flash of typhoon at the center of the work, quote, surely comparable in foreboding and whiteness to Melville's white whale and Coleridge's albatross, emblems of that belief which allowed and supported something like the slave trade, the belief which engenders the white race as well as the African, which endangers the white race as well as the African, end of the quote. Pleasant replies simply, quote, I think the difference between us may be reduced to the fact that while you focus on the background of the Turner painting, I cannot tear my eyes from the foreground. Earlier, Pleasant described the transformative event of her initial encounter with Turner's dystopian painting. Quote, my eyes were locked on the foreground of the painting, where a few brown arms, some lengths of chain, and one brown leg glanced through the waves alongside magnificently colored fish. The fish were clearly in their habitat. The arms and legs and chains were alien to the sea. I was grateful that the artist had portrayed it thus, indicating the horror of the thing aslant by those few members and a reminder of their confinement, the irons which would take them down. It got to me all right. I really would recommend all of you who have not read it to check out Cliff's novel. Pleasant then concludes her letter, as well as her dialogue with Hooper, with the acknowledgement, quote, it is who we are. Now, similarly, whereas Wood's humanist reading asks us to understand the clone children as figures of ordinary kids and us, by which Wood means, of course, himself, a political allegorical reading of the novel instead brings into focus the way that these children, much like the slaves in the economy of the antebellum US, are precisely those who enable ordinary kids and us in the situation that Davies describes as neoliberalism's golden age in the 1990s to have the free time to consume complex aesthetic achievements and contemplate our human existential finitude. While in our world we do not literally harvest the organs of young adults, neoliberalism does engage in the hyperexploitation of the biopower of young bodies to fuel the ceaseless expansion of a consumer service economy. A 2017 UNICEF-sponsored report on child labor in the fashion supply chain notes that an estimated 170 million, or 11% of the world's children, are in situations that deprive them of the right to go to school without interference from work. Many of these child laborers work within the fashion supply chain, making the textiles and garments to satisfy the demands of consumers in Europe, the US, and beyond. As with the clones in Ishiguro's novel, quote, children are seen as obedient workers who slip under the radar, making them easy to manage. Moreover, akin to the national situation portrayed in the novel, in our global present, Wood's we manage largely to keep these deplorable conditions of hyperexploitation out of sight. Quote, children work at all stages of the supply chain in the fashion industry, from the production of cotton seeds in Benin, harvesting in Uzbekistan, yarn spinning in India, right through to the different phases of putting garments together in factories across Bangladesh. Such a situation then becomes a self-reproductive one. Quote, if parents have no education, they will end up in low-paid work. Their children will be forced to work. They will miss out on their educations, and they too will end up in low-paid work as adults. Now, Davies points out that under the normative neoliberalism of the 1990s, quote, the task of the government was now to ensure that winners were clearly distinguishable from losers, and that the contest was perceived as fair. Coupled to markets and quasi-market contests, the ideal is that of meritocracy, of award being legitimately earned rather than arbitrarily inherited. End of the quote. This pedagogical training is mirrored in Never Let Me Go when one of the clone children reflects on their origins, or what they refer to as their possibles. Quote, were modeled from trash. Junkies, prostitutes, winos, tramps, convicts, maybe, just as long as they aren't psychos. That's where we come from. We know it, so we might as well just say it. If you want to look for our possibles, if you want to do it properly, then you look in the gutter. You look in the rubbish bins, look down the toilet. That's where you'll find where we all come from. Now, Ishiguro's disturbing lesson in Never Let Me Go, then, is that the clones are already among us. They make up, along with junkies, sex workers, convicts, the homeless, war refugees, child laborers, undocumented workers, and the structurally under and unemployed, the throwaway populations littering our grim neoliberal landscape, and to which the elites in the most developed nation, Wood's normative, ordinary us's, the winners in neoliberalism's contest of individuals and family, are more than happy to turn a blind eye. Formally operating then in a way akin to Turner's paintings, Ishiguro's allegorical dystopias enable a estranging critical glimpse of the horror of the thing aslant by those few members, and a reminder of their confinement, the irons which would take them all down. Now, in his Nobel lecture, My 20th Century Evening and Other Small Breakthroughs, Ishiguro highlights a number of the key themes at work in what I would now like to refer to as his neoliberal dystopia trilogy. First, after discussing his earliest efforts as a fiction writer, Ishiguro refers to his experiences in the United Kingdom following his emigration at the age of 5 from Japan. Quote, when I look back at this period and remember it was less than 20 years from the end of a world war in which the Japanese had been their bitter enemies, I'm amazed by the openness and instinctive generosity with which our family was accepted by this ordinary English community. The affection, respect, and curiosity are retained to this day for that generation of Britons who came through the Second World War and built a remarkable new welfare state in its aftermath, derives significantly from my personal experience from those years. End of the quote. Now, the contrast between this pre-Second World War and the emergent post-war realities of the welfare state is at the heart of the remains of the day. However, if we read that novel, as I suggested earlier, as a symbolic act emerging in response to the decade-long period Davies identifies as combative neoliberalism, then the novel appeals to be really about the contemporary threat to the hard-won post-war realities of the welfare state, and in particular, the avenues it offered to class and other forms of social mobility. The post-war world is given figuration in the novel in an exchange between the first-person narrator, the longtime head butler at Darlington Hall, Mr. Stevens — the reader never in fact learns his first name — and the resident of a nearby village, Mr. Harry Smith, over the nature of dignity. Smith proclaims, quote, "Dignity isn't just something gentlemen have. Dignity is something every man and woman in this country can strive for and get." He then continues, quote, "That's what we fought Hitler for, after all. If Hitler had had his things his way, we'd be slaves now. The whole world would be a few masters and millions upon millions of slaves. And I don't need to remind anyone here, there's no dignity to be had in being a slave. That's what we fought for, and that's what we won. We won the right to be free citizens, and it's one of the privileges of being born English that no matter who you are, no matter if you're rich or poor, you're born free, and you're born so that you can express your opinion freely and vote in your member of parliament or vote him out. That's what dignity's really about, if you'll excuse me, sir." End of the quote. Now, shortly thereafter, this scene is encountered with a contrast that Stephen has before the war, around 1935, with a friend of his master, the appropriately named Mr. Spencer. And this is, of course, a slide from the multiple Academy Award nominated film adaptation of Remains of the Day. Now, after a series of questions designed to humiliate Stevens, Spencer triumphantly declares that our man here is unable to assist us in these matters. Spencer then continues, quote, "And yet we still persist with the notion that this nation's decisions be left in the hands of our good man here and to the few million others like him. Is it any wonder, saddled as we are with our present parliamentary system, that we are unable to find any solution to our many difficulties? Why, you may as well ask a committee of the Mothers' Union to organize a war campaign." End of the quote. Later, Darlington explains to Stevens, quote, "We're really slow in this country to recognize when a thing's outmoded. Other great nations know full well that to meet the challenges of each new age means discarding old, sometimes well-loved methods." Now, if on the literal level, the outmoded practices Darlington refers to here are the pre-war forms of parliamentary democracy, after the war, Darlington is exposed as a fascist sympathizer and a provider of aid to the Nazi cause, and he is fully ostracized in the years before his death. In the novel's allegorical schema, they also refer to the welfare state in the 1980s. By the time we arrive at Klara and the Sun, the full devastating effects of this now more than 4-decade-long assault will become fully apparent. Back to Ishiguro had his noble lecture. Now, later in the lecture, Ishiguro points toward the second period in Davies' schema, when he notes that, quote, "The era since the fall of the Berlin Wall seems like one of complacency, of opportunities lost. Enormous inequalities of wealth and opportunity have been allowed to grow between nations and within nations." End of his quote. This is the moment of the allegorical critique I elaborated a moment ago in Never Let Me Go. Ishiguro then quickly leaps to our present, in which, quote, "The disastrous invasion of Iraq in 2003, the long years of austerity policies imposed on ordinary people following the scandalous economic crash of 2008 has brought us to a present in which far-right ideologies and tribal nationalisms proliferate. Racism in its traditional form and in its modernized, better marketed versions is once again on the rise, stirring beneath our civilized streets like a buried monster awakening. For the moment, we seem to lack any progressive cause to unite us. Instead, even in the wealthy democracies of the West, we're fracturing into rival camps from which to compete bitterly for resources or power. End of the quote. He then adds, in what sounds like a preview of some of the central concerns of Klara and the Sun, quote, and around the corner, or have we already turned this corner, is the challenge posed by stunning breakthroughs in science, technology, and medicine. New genetic technologies such as gene editing technique, CRISPR, and the advances in artificial intelligence and robotics will bring us amazing life-saving benefits, but may also create savage meritocracies that resemble apartheid and massive unemployment, including to those in the current professional elites. Now, a society of savage meritocracies that resemble apartheid and massive unemployment, including to the nose in the current professional elites. This sounds like a characterization of the world we find in Klara and the Sun. The question the novel asks then, is this society a non-existent one around the corner, or have we already turned this corner? Now, Ishiguro concludes his talk with what he jokingly refers to as his noble appeal. If we are to get the best from the writers of today and tomorrow, I believe we must become more diverse in two particular senses. He casts the first in global spatial terms. Quote, we must widen our common literary world to include many more voices from beyond our comfort zones of the elite first world cultures. End of the quote. His second appeal, however, unfolds more specifically in terms of genre. Quote, we must take great care not to set too narrowly or conservatively our definitions of what constitutes good literature. The next generation will come with all sorts of new, sometimes bewildering ways to tell important and wonderful stories. We must keep our minds open to them, especially regarding genre and form, so that we can nurture and celebrate the best of them. In a time of dangerously increasing division, we must listen. Good writing and good reading will break down barriers. We may even find a new idea, a great humane vision around which to rally. End of the quote. Now, Ishiguro returns to this theme in a 2021 Guardian interview that takes place shortly after the publication of Klara and the Sun. Quote, amid the establishment harumphing, when Dylan was awarded the Nobel for Literature the year before him, Ishiguro was delighted. Absolutely, he should have had it, he says. I think people like Dylan and Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell are, in a sense, literary artists as well as performance artists. And I think it is a good that the Nobel Prize recognizes that. Interestingly, the recognition of Dylan, Cohen, and Mitchell as literary artists is exactly what David Mitchell undertakes in his most recent and extraordinary, to my reading, novel, Utopia Avenue from 2020. However, in addition to his challenge to what the interviewer's author refers to as artistic silos, Ishiguro now further expands his call for diversity. He would like to see, quote, he would like to see more diversity, not just in terms of ethnicity, but also class. As he points out, he is unusual among his literary contemporaries in having attended a state grammar school and one of the then new campus universities. Ishiguro quips, quote, it is not enough just to look at the ethnicity question if it is just a variation on that old joke that the BBC is open to people of every religious belief, race, and sexual orientation, as long as they've been to Oxford or Cambridge. Now, with these multiple references to the increasingly rigid class stratifications of our world, produced and reproduced by the contemporary university, we arrive back at the heart of the concerns of Klara and the Sun. I think for the rest of this part of the talk, we'll go back to Turner. In many ways, as Ishiguro's Nobel speech also suggests, the novel opens a multiform allegory of the neoconservative regimes that have appeared in the UK and the US in the years since the 2016 Brexit vote and Donald Trump's election as president. Read in this way, AFs like Klara become figures of demonized immigrant populations imagined to be stealing our or ordinary people's jobs. Furthermore, what Ishiguro refers to as the social fracturing into rival camps from which to compete bitterly for resources or power is represented in Josie's father, Paul, who we learn late in the novel has relocated to an urban community that it's begun to arm itself. Paul expresses his divisive paranoia a few pages later when he tells Helen, quote, "Where you're living now, it may not always remain so peaceful. You hear what's happened in the city last week? I'm not saying you're in danger right now, but you need to think ahead. When I speak with Chrissy about this, she just shrugs. But you need to think about this. Think ahead about Rick as much as about yourself." Finally, even the children's at-home schooling recall the dark days of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. And in fact, my own children did not attend in-person classes from March 2020 until fall 2021, or from the midpoint of the spring semester of their sophomore year in high school until the beginning of their senior year. Now, however, what I find most interesting in Klara and the Sun lies in the novel's powerful portrayal of the ways that changes in the last 4 decades in an institution that never appears directly in the novel have contributed mightily to the emergence of this new order. I am referring here to the modern university. Christopher Newfield, in his already classic study Unmaking the Public University, The 40-Year Assault on Higher Education, published in 2008, shows how beginning in the late 1970s, the university became a central target of the neoconservative revolution. The consequences of the successful campaign are brilliantly allegorized throughout Klara and the Sun. In the novel's non-existent society, public education has apparently disappeared, at least for those in the elite classes. Tenure has vanished along with any collective labor organization, as teachers have been reduced to just-in-time, on-demand contract employees who must satisfy the whims of their student customers or risk losing their livelihoods. Humanities are also nowhere to be seen, as all education seems to be geared exclusively to what the historian Alan Taylor calls individual economic goods. These are in distinction to the collective political goods that both Thomas Jefferson and the architects of the post-war university were convinced are at least equally important if democratic societies are to survive. Moreover, the dramatic shrinking of both employment prospects and the decline in opportunities for a high-quality education have created a new ruthlessness in the competition for spots in the remaining universities. The withering critique of the destructive effects of this war of all against all on family relationships is one of the novel's greatest achievements. When Paul asks Christy why she continues hanging on to her corporate job, she replies, quote, "I keep hanging on, as you put it, because on the day I stop, Josie's world, my world, would collapse." However, what becomes evident is that the world she speaks of seems to revolve exclusively around Josie's eventual admission into a university. This is absolutely necessary, as it seems to Chrissy's that the teens to be the teen's only hope of reproducing in adulthood her current class position. Now, the destructiveness of the modes of this mode of living is most effectively figured through the novel's central mystery. In the course of Klara's narration, the reader learns that Josie's older sister, Sal, has already died of an unnamed illness, which now threatens to take Josie as well. We soon learn that their condition is the result of a genetic editing procedure, AGE, or what is popularly referred to as being lifted, in order to increase their intellectual skills. Parents voluntarily submit their children at a young age to this procedure. Of course, AGE, or age in Ishiguro's pun, is costly and hence limited to the increasingly smaller number of elites in this society. Even more significantly, the procedure is dangerous as it puts the children at real risk of severe illness and even death. However, there's an important caveat at work here. Children who have not been lifted have almost no chance of being admitted to any university. This turns out to be the case for Rick, and this despite the fact that he's an intelligent, curious, and creative young person. Indeed, far more than most of the lifted children he encounters at Josie's interaction meeting. The situation is explained to Rick during a meeting with his mother's former lover, Vance, who is now a high-ranking official at the imaginary Atlas Brookings College, or ABC. Quote, Atlas Brookings believes there are many talented kids out there just like you who, for reasons economic or otherwise, never receive the benefits of age. The college also believes society is currently making a grave error and not allowing those talents to come to full fruition. Unfortunately, most other institutions don't think this way, which means we receive vastly more applicants from people like yourself than we're able to accommodate. We can weed out no-hopers, but after that, frankly, it becomes a lottery. Now, this situation places the mothers of these children in an impossible double bind. If they hope to reproduce for their children the privileges in which they have heretofore existed, parents must put their children's health and even survival at risk. Conversely, by protecting them from these physical risks, they seem to guarantee a limited future for them. Late in the novel, when Josie appears to be very near death, her mother, Christy, justifies the choices she has made in this fashion. Quote, I ask because everything about Josie from the moment I first held her, everything about her told me she was hungry for life. The whole world excited her. That's how I knew from the start I couldn't deny her the chance. She was demanding a future worthy of her spirit, my title. That's what I mean by saying she played for high stakes, end of the quote. Of course, Josie has not had any agency in this decision. This is the case even though shortly thereafter, Rick conveys to Chrissy Josie's assurances, quote, that if she had the power to do it again, and this time it was up to her, she says she'd do exactly what you did. In this statement, both Rick and Ishiguro subtly underscore the fact that such a state of freedom is always illusory. We can never do anything again. This recalls one of the most important lessons of an earlier masterpiece of modern British literature, also written by an emigre, Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim. Ultimately, Klara and the Sun leaves open the question, is the future promised to Josie a replication of a grim status quo, what Lee Edelman terms reproductive futurity, where the middle classes must work extraordinarily hard only to stay in the same place? Is this future one that is worthy of a spirit hungry for life and excited by the whole world? Now, the unbearable pressures put on her lead Josie's mother to launch a savage assault on Rick precisely at the moment when the boy is mostly deeply involved in the care of her daughter. Quote, now what about you, Rick? Do you really think you were so smart? Do you believe of the two of you, you've come out the winner? Because if that's so, then please ask yourself this. What is it that you've won? Take a look at your future. She waved her hand at the window. You've played for low stakes, and what you've won is small and mean. You may feel pretty smug just now, but I'm here to tell you, you've got no reason to be feeling that way. No reason at all. Now, the ironies in her assertion are multiple. Not only has Rick never expressed anything approaching such a sentiment, he, as with Josie, had no choice in his current predicament. Moreover, the only one who appears to agree with Chrissy is Rick's mother, Helen. Earlier during their visit to the city, Chrissy asks Helen if she regrets, quote, not going ahead with Rick. Helen then responds, quote, yes. If I'm honest, Chrissy, the answer is yes. Even after seeing what it's brought you, I feel I feel I didn't do my best for him. And I just I was somewhere else in my mind and I just let the moment go past. Perhaps that's what I regret more than anything else, that I never loved him enough to make the proper decision one way or the other. Now, this leads Helen to allow a vindictive Vance to humiliate and debase her, all in the desperate and ultimately futile hope that he might use his influence to help her son, quote, have a fighting chance in this world. Now, following on the heels of this earlier episode, then, what Josie's mother is doing in her assault on Rick is no more than trying to justify her own impossible decision. Yes, both of my daughters died because of the genetic editing procedure, but the alternative, life without the class status she's always known, would be far worse. Moreover, this suggests that Rick's reporting of Josie's supposed final words may in fact be no more than a projection of his own sentiments concerning his mother's decision. And it is here where the novel resonates so profoundly with my own recent experiences. As in the very moment I was reading it, my twin son and daughter, Owen and Nadia, were fully immersed in their own college applications. This past year has been reported in numerous outlets. The competition for places at elite universities in the US has grown extremely fierce. Even my own institution, the University of Florida, currently ranked by US News and World Reports, the preeminent resource in these regards, in a three-way tie as the fifth best public university in the nation. It recently was reported that at UF, there has been a far lower number of applicants admitted than in years past, only reportedly 22%, down from a previous low of 31%. As rejections from some of the elite schools to which our children applied began to arrive in the mail, and this despite the fact that they had, at our rigorous and demanding local international baccalaureate high school, attendance at which meant, among other sacrifices, many hours of commuting back and forth across, some of the highest GPAs in their graduating class, a similar sense of guilt, failure, and resentment began to set in. We began to second guess our past decisions. Why did we take them to visit Athens and Zakynthos, thinking that exposure to Greek and Ionian culture and history would be of lasting value to them, rather than enrolling them in another standardized test preparation program or asking them to take place in some charity event? We even considered at one point keeping them at home next year and working with high-priced admissions counselors in order that they could reapply the following years. Now, I am a first-generation student, and my undergraduate education was at a second-tier public university in California. However, my undergraduate education began exactly 40 years ago this coming fall, in the earliest days of the neoliberal assault on the welfare state and higher education. The world my children are entering, like Josie and Rick, is a very different one. And I feared that without the resources offered by an elite university education, they would find it extremely difficult to have a fighting chance in our increasingly dark times. Now, the devastating consequences on individuals and their relationships with others of the thwarting of this desire for reproductive futurity becomes most evident in perhaps the most unsettling turn in the novel. We learn early on that Josie, when healthy, has to visit the city in order to get her portrait completed. However, this portrait turns out not to be a painting, but rather a precise android replication of the teenage girl. Moreover, Klara and the reader subsequently discover that in the unlikely event Josie dies, Klara will have her consciousness transferred to this artificial daughter, where she will then use her superb powers of observation, which, in a textbook demonstration of the Russian formalist notion of the motivation of the device, also makes her an ideal narrator. She will become Josie. I believe that the novel's figure of the portrait thus stands as Ishiguro's most scathing ethical condemnation of the sterility and emptiness of neoliberal reproductive futurity. Now, on a superficial level, the novel's conclusion seems quite dark, and this is because Josie recovers from her near-death experience. Playing a bit with Stefan Todorov's notion of the fantastic, Ishiguro leaves it undecidable whether her unexpected recovery occurs for purely natural reasons or because of Klara's passionate appeals for intercession by an anthropomorphized son, the son of the title, always referred to by Klara in the masculine. As the years pass, Josie and Rick gradually drift apart, and ultimately Josie departs for the university, thereby realizing her mother's designs. All those who provided Josie with the support necessary to arrive at this stage are then rapidly dispensed with. Rick remains in the vicinity and appears to have accepted the fate assigned to him by this grim neoliberal order. Quote, "It couldn't have worked out, me going to college trying to compete with all those lifted kids. I've got my own plans now, and that's how it should be." In passing, we also learned that the housekeeper Melania has departed the household and now resides somewhere in California. Most depressing of all is the fate of Klara. After helping Josie through her medical crisis and thus made redundant in Chrissy's plans by the girl's survival, Klara is increasingly pushed to the margins. Coming to recognize, quote, that her presence wasn't appropriate as it had once been, Klara relocates from Josie's bedroom to utility room on the house's upper landing. Klara remains there until the girl departs for the university. Shortly thereafter, Klara is sent to a junkyard where she passively awaits her slow fade alongside other AFs, the remains of severed cables, and dented grill panels. Klara also suggests that she is dispensed with so perfunctorily because, quote, her continued presence brought difficult memories for Josie's mother. Now, this is a fate Klara fully accepts as a necessity. One day, while standing immobilized in the yard, the manager from her original store comes upon Klara. When the manager asks about her subsequent years, Klara informs her, "I was with Josie all the time until she went to college." The manager replies, quote, "So it was successful, a successful home." Klara then proclaims, quote, "Yes, I believe I gave good service and prevented Josie from becoming lonely." Now, in this case, success seems to be defined solely in terms of neoliberal reproductive futurity. Like the clones that never let me go, or the children in our neoliberal world working in the fashion industry, Klara serves as the novel's key allegory of disposable labor in a service economy. In this conclusion, it would seem then that short of true catastrophe, barbarism rather than socialism, or the mutual ruin of all the contending classes, the terrible futurity of punitive neoliberalism is destined to reproduce itself into any foreseeable future. However, the recent Guardian interview with Ishiguro I touched on earlier concludes in this very interesting fashion. For the first time, Ishiguro is beginning to fear for the future, not just the consequences of climate change, but other issues raised in Klara: artificial intelligence, gene editing, big data, and their implications for equality and democracy. The nature of capitalism itself is changing its models, he says. I do worry that we are not in control anymore of these things. Yet he hopes that Klara and the Sun will be read as a cheerful, optimistic novel. But as always with Ishiguro, any consolation has to be earned. By presenting a very difficult world, you can show the brightness, you can show the sunniness. Now, I think Ishiguro is in fact able to end his novel on a note of hope, and this occurs precisely because of his familiarity with and skillful deployment of the dystopian narrative form. One thing we have to keep in mind is that everything we learn in the novel is mediated through Klara's narrow perspective. In this regard, Klara and the Sun parallels its magnificent predecessor, Zamyatin's We. Recall that We ends with the now lobotomized D503 proclaiming, quote, I am certain we shall conquer because reason must prevail. However, in the immediately prior paragraph, he observes, quote, in the western part of the city, there is still chaos, roaring, corpses, beasts, and unfortunately, a considerable group of numbers who have betrayed reason. Thus, what he presents as a fact certain and must prevail, is no more than an expression of his and the one state's desire. Similarly, throughout Klara and the Sun, Ishiguro provides subtle glimpses of growing dissatisfaction with and resistance to such a world. I already mentioned the political activists that Klara and Chrissy encounter in the city. Moreover, whatever the potential pitfalls of his specific actions, Josie's father describes his new existence in quite positive terms. Quote, "I'm sharing my life with some very fine people, and most of them came down the same road I did. It's become clear to all of us now there are many different ways to lead a decent and full life." Finally, and most significantly, there are signs that Josie and Rick have benefited from their interactions and experiences and are embarking on another possible future. On the day of her departure, Josie informs Klara that at her school, quote, "We're all supposed to set these official targets," to what we call metrics today, 2 targets in each of the 5 categories. I had to fill in a form about it, but I cheated because I figured out my own secret targets, nothing to do with the ones on the form. Boy, would they have not liked my real list. And in no way is mom ever hearing about it either. Moreover, a few pages earlier, Klara tells Rick that, quote, "It brings me anxiety to see Rick and Josie with such separate plans." However, Rick replies, quote, "I suppose I'm saying, Josie, Josie and I will always be together at some level, some deeper one, even if we go out there and don't see each other anymore. I can't speak for her, but once I'm out there, I know I'll always keep searching for someone just like her, or at least the Josie I once knew." Then immediately after Josie informs Klara about her secret targets, Klara tells us that Rick, quote, "was many miles away that day, meeting his new friends to talk about his hard to detect data gathering devices." All of this suggests that Josie and Rick really do remain together in the future, and that both have learned ways, arming themselves with silence, exile, and cunning, to circumvent the dire mechanisms of a neoliberal reproductive futurity. And with this, we have at last completed the allegorical schema at work in Klara and the Sun. And allow me to share this with you today. Let me conclude then with Paul's brief observation concerning Rick. Quote, "Rick's turned into a fine young man. I hope he's able to find a path through the mess we've bequeathed to his generation." These sentiments apply equally to Josie and to my children, Nadia and Owen. Come the fall, they will be attending respectively the University of Florida to study entomology, theater, and visual arts, and Reed College in Oregon, one of the few institutions that refuses to participate in pernicious ranking systems, to study climate change, biology, and history. And indeed, so many of the students and I hope many of you, have had the great privilege to encounter in recent years. This then may be the most important lesson of Klara and the Sun for those of us who have bequeathed to their generation such a mess of the planet. The time is long since passed for us normal kids to stop telling a younger generation how they should be, and instead to begin to listen to their ideas of how we'll all together could be. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for such an enlightening and interesting contribution to the discussion. I was very curious. I thought it was intriguing that you mentioned The Remains of the Day together with the dystopia novels. But I'm sure that Julia has a very specific question about that. So I would actually invite Julia and Samuel to join us for the where are you? Both of you? Ah, there they are. Okay, Samuel is there. Julia. Okay, so I think both Julia and Samuel will have a question. They were making comments here on the in our chat. So maybe they could start by asking these questions, and then we'll pass on to the questions of those that are listening to us and attending your lecture online. So, Julia, would you like to start? Because, I mean, I mentioned the remains of the day, which was something that actually struck me as something I had never thought about. So maybe you could ask a question about it.
Yes. First of all, Philip, thank you so much for your talk. As Sandra said, it was very enlightening and very interesting. I think it's a very original approach to these three novels. Unfortunately, I haven't read Klara and the Sun. It's been on the pile for quite some times now. But yes, I was also quite surprised to see Remains of the Day in what you've called the neoliberal dystopian novels, right? The trilogy, right? You've included them as a trilogy, and I think this is a very interesting approach. So my first question would actually be. Actually, it's more of a comment, and I would like you. Could you perhaps elaborate on this approximation between the historical novel and the dystopian form, especially regarding The Remains of the Day?
Yes, thank you so much. And I can see some really marvelous questions appearing in the chat, and I hope we have time to address many of them today. In part, what I was building on here is Frederick Jameson's great essay, Progress or Utopia, republished in Archaeology of the Future, where he argues, in taking Georg Lukács's discussion in the historical novel as foundational, that the realist historical novel in the 19th century, at the latter part of the 19th century, begins to fade in its capacity of creating for the first time, and this is crucial for Lukács, of course, it's the radical potential of the form, creating for the first time the sense of our own present being in historical production, always to be in the process of changing. I often think of the great image for Lukács would be the image in George Pal's 1960 adaptation of The Time Machine, of the buildings rising and melting as the time traveler rapidly leaps in to the future. Lukács argues that this power, for a variety of reasons, ends in the late 19th century, and the progressive capacities of the historical novel disappear. Jameson very interestingly says that, in fact, these powers of thinking of the present as history migrate to the new genre of science fiction, which presents imaginary futures that then by themselves cast the present in a new kind of a critical, estranging light, to show the present as itself in the throes of change. And it's, again, never for Jameson science fiction as a form of futurology or prediction, but rather of the critical work it does on the present. And I think this is exactly what links for me the work of Remains of the Day with his later dystopias proper. And again, I did want to emphasize that even Never Let Me Go is in some quarters not considered a dystopia, that the classic dystopia by necessity needs to be a projection of an imaginary future of our world. And Never Let Me Go participates in the dystopian or the science fictional subgenre of the alternate history. So what Ishiguro does, and this is something that continues throughout all of his work, right, is experiments with these different generic forms. And this is what I want to suggested, what is exactly what leads to criticism of his work by some more conservative theorists and critics of the novel, is experiments with these various forms to enable us to see the situation in which we're living in a new way. That the real interest in Remains of the Day isn't some antiquarian recovery of the 1930s, or even an antiquarian recovery of the 1950s, but to really bring us into focus the way in which our own present is beginning to diverge from what for Ishiguro is, as he says explicitly in his Nobel speech. And it's an incredible document, by the way. I'd recommend anyone taking a look at, because Ishiguro, in his beautifully restrained fashion that's always occurs throughout his own fictions, and this touches on one of the questions I saw in the conversation about the localization of his perspective in his works, that in his very subtle way manages to highlight all the central themes of his work. And that what Ishiguro says is really focusing on here is that in the moment of what Davies calls combative neoliberalism, the achievements, the utopia of the post-war world into which he was introduced in England is coming to an end. And I think it's this mechanism that then links it very precisely to the similar work performed in all three texts, despite their sense of dystopia in a narrowly generic or typological sense. That the dystopia for in Ishiguro's hands becomes more of what Northrop Frye would call a mode rather than a genre. I hope that's helpful.
No, it is. It is very helpful. So sorry, I wanna understand this. I'm not gonna take up the whole discussion. I'm gonna let everyone talk. But I find this this comment very interesting, because it seems to me that your this approximation is dealt with in terms of historical approach, right? And to perhaps we can say a discursive mode that allows for the possibility of criticism of progress, of historical progress, right? And I would like to ask a follow-up question then, which would regard the notion of futurity and of progress in dystopian novels, which is something that really interests me in this specific genre. And this is why I find this approximation with the historical novel so interesting. So it seems the temporalities that are constructed, right, in contemporary dystopian novels, it seems that there is, let's say, a smaller gap between the present and the future. The future is much nearer to our historical present than in novels that were produced in the early 20th century, in which you had this really you had a century, 100 years into the future or 50 years into the future, and these futures seemed much nearer to our historical present. So I would like to know if you could perhaps talk a little bit about this notion of futurity in relation to progress, right? The parallel between futurity and progress. And also this, what critics have been talking about the end of history, which is very prominent in the dystopian novels, especially in contemporary dystopian novels, right? And perhaps if you could reflect upon this in relation to this neoliberal dystopian trilogy by Ishiguro.
Ooh, those are great questions. Thank you. And I'll try to be a little more precise in my discussions now, so we can get to other questions. It's a great set of issues. I mean, I would say at first, I think it's very important to distinguish two senses of futurity, right? Futurity as qualitative change. And that can be either in the sense of progress as a bettering of the future, or as destruction, right? As a far worse future, which is of course that what the dystopia is primarily interested in producing here. I guess my thinking always goes back to someone I talk about in my first book on the classical utopian genre, imaginary communities, utopia and dystopia. That is Karl Mannheim, and his distinction between, in fact, four forms of futurity, and progress then would only be one of them, right? As four forms of affirmative futurity, one that posits, yes, qualitative change, but qualitative change that unfolds only gradually rather than through a constitutive break, right, between the present and the future. And in the classical utopian fiction, the question, once this utopia has been moved from an imaginary other community located in the world to an imaginary future, though many critics have long identified Thomas More's utopia is already itself an image of a future England transformed. So that element of futurity is always in the book. But once that the question of the transformation of our present into this imaginary future always becomes a central issue in these works. Interestingly, when we arrive at the dystopia in the late 19th century, this question of transition often disappears completely. And I think this already leads to the narrowing of the gap that you are talking about here, because this already gets to the second sense of futurity that I was primarily interested in this paper, and especially in the discussion of Klara and the Sun, the most classic dystopia of Ishiguro's work, what has been termed reproductive futurity. And this is a futurity that is not qualitatively different. There may be new changes in fashion, there may be new technological developments like artificial intelligences or clones, but the situation is qualitatively the same as the present. And hence the role becomes of the work to bring into focus precisely those elements of the dystopian elements, to use it in what I prefer not ever to do. I've written about this as well, that we should never use utopia as an adjective, or dystopia, excuse me. We should never use dystopia as an adjective, but only a noun. But for a moment, to take up the practice that I would like to forbid, to bring into focus the dystopian elements of our own present. And in a sense, this closing of the gap can be seen there at the very beginning, right? In something like Jack London's The Iron Heel, which is about really the transformation of the dystopias of the present into this more clearly dystopian near future. And then in a sense, the gap between them, once the questions of the transformation disappear, become irrelevant. Zamyatin will locate it centuries future. Huxley in the next major entry, it's indeterminate. And then, as you said, right, Julia, by the time we get to Orwell, it's collapsed to less than a half century. And even for Orwell, that period was completely arbitrary. He only chooses 1984 because he's writing his 1984 in 1948. So it's simply a transposition of that. So, in a sense, the gap between the present and the future is irrelevant to these works. What I think you're hitting on here is something else that's very, very important here in the flourishing of the dystopia in our present. What we seem to be losing in so many of them is something that was crucial for the earliest writers of the form, and which later Tom Moylan identifies as reemerging in the 1990s in what he calls the critical dystopia. One of my long debates with Tom, and I think he has actually come to a very similar position, that critical dystopia is in fact the original form of dystopia, and the more sort of despairing, closed forms of dystopia are really a later development. What I find so fascinating about Ishiguro's work is precisely the way in which he subtly reintroduces the elements of the critical dystopia. And I think that might be one of the importance of his fiction for us in this moment. And he does so, which is so fascinating. This is one of my most speculative points here, I'll admit. I haven't seen if there's any evidence of this, but I think formally at least, right, if there is no elements of direct influence, that Ishiguro clearly to me is a great reader of classical dystopias. And the way in which I realized finishing this paper that Klara and Son is very close to Zamyatin's We. That it doesn't, and this is what he's saying in the interview, that he's not going to give you any cheap Hollywood, right, happy ending. But what he's going to show is that in any situation of seeming closure, there are possibilities of change emerging, and that all we need to do is learn to listen to them. And I think for Ishiguro, the hope is in a younger generation. But if we need to let go our senses of reproductive futurity, that our children need to be us, because the us, as he says, is a pretty terrible thing right now.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that. Samuel also has a question. Perhaps he can ask it in person.
Hi, first of all, Philip, thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. I have to rewatch it like 3 times to just understand everything that you brought to us. I have a question. Could you elaborate on the function of the weirdness of Ishiguro and Vonnegut's style? Does it merely help build science fiction sense of strangeness, or can it mean something more as well? Because like I was wondering if this has something to do with the enhanced sense of displacement of the human in the modern world, and it warps our capacity to properly apprehend the world. You know, there's always an overwhelming sense that something's escaping us because the world is not subject to human logic anymore, but a logic of progress. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful set of questions. And again, thank you to you as well for bringing this event together. As for your first point, I actually take it as a compliment that you said you'll need to rewatch the lecture a number of 3 times, because I'm a great student as well of Pierre Bayard, who argues that we can never read anything for the first time, that we always are involved in a process of rereading, and in that rereading we engage in the creative process of writing anew each of the works. So I hope that there will be some creative possibilities in this for you as well. I think your question about that passage that I read about when Ishiguro received the Nobel Prize, about the weirdness of his fiction, is really an interesting one that I hadn't thought about a lot yet, but is very much worth thinking further, because for an initial, thoughts on this, what I think that writer is focusing on is precisely the way, and very positively in this case, unlike some of the other critics that I mentioned, especially Wood and Self, is that sounds like a legal firm, Wood and Self, but that the way in which this critic is focusing on the productive play that Ishiguro enables by not adhering to, again, the logic of reproductive futurity generically, by exploring these the capacities of these different generic forms. And I think the writer also grasps something that I write about in in Shockwaves of Possibility, in the way in which Darko Suvin's classic definition of science fiction as a literature of cognitive estrangement, that what Suvin helps us understand is that science fiction is a particularly kind of modernist realist form, and that it engages in what modernist fictions, and that's my link to of Ishiguro in passing to Conrad, to James Joyce, other writers linking of him to Kafka, which I think is very right, were all to indicate precisely this, that what these other writers are able to accomplish in matters of form, science fiction does in its realistic content. And that it's this, as you beautifully put it here, that opens up a sense of the lack of the gap between the human senses of the world and other possibilities. And what I like in your further statement, and also like to build upon in my own thinking a little bit, is you suggested the sense of this being inhuman, right? That it is the reason of the neoliberal order that dominates the human. But it can also be, right, thought of in a more affirmative sense as the weirdness of the post-human, right? Human defined itself as a narrow sort of form of reproductive futurity, of a certain definition of enlightenment definition of the human. And it's that sense, right, and tension and play between both of those that I think is so significant for Ishiguro's work. I mean, again and again, as many commentators have said, all of his works are set in moments of tremendous change. Even The Buried Giant, which I would recommend, despite Wood's review, as well worth reading for the way in which it uses this. But even that work is dealing, unlike many fantasies, in a moment of tremendous social upheaval and change. And so it's that doubleness that I think is perhaps one of the most useful ways to define this weirdness in Ishiguro's work.
You're muted, Sandra.
Yeah, I have just realized that. I have just realized that. So there are some questions from the public, which I would. Are you okay with?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually
yes.
happy. I don't know. I can't remember your schedule, but I'm happy if
No,
you'd
no.
like
I
to
think we
continue
still have some time. So
a little longer today, past our cutoff point.
No, that's okay. I think we have 3 more questions because somewhere else has just been put to you. So I think we have 3 more. One of them is by Anderson Faleiro. Well, he congratulates you on your, he says, great speech, your great talk. So he says, it was very good to see that you have been worrying, let's say, about the worries, and or at least you have been dealing with the worries and distresses of the metropolitan world. But he says he was curious whether at some point you tried to explore the periphery of the world in your, let's say, in your work, in your reflections, in your production.
Yeah, well, I see that the question is referring particularly to Ishiguro's work, and I think this is a fabulous question. I saw it at the beginning of the talk, because many commentators have pointed out the way in which Ishiguro's work in terms of the novelistic tradition is closer, despite his use of these various generic forms, closer to what Mikhail Bakhtin refers to as the first stylistic trend in the novel, in British literature most classically represented by someone like Jane Austen, rather than the more open spatial orientation of the second stylistic tradition. And that he always looks at the sense of very enclosed worlds here. And that the focus really is, especially in these three novels, on the situation of Great Britain, in the contemporary situation of Great Britain in Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, and then the United States, and the fact that that shift itself is actually worthy of more reflection in the United States in Klara and the Sun. But what I think is most interesting here is that, again, just as the way in which Ishiguro is always able to highlight precisely the limitations of his narrators and their own desire for a limited, constrained kinds of worlds, Ishiguro highlights that same fantasy within the first worlds as well, and that we always see places that break it open, this sense of the enclosure. I think it's most dramatically evident in the way in Never Let Me Go, for example, in the way in which the novel's allegorical spatial construction of this England. And it's even interesting to me that it's set in Great Britain, but Ishiguro uses the older term. And interestingly, there might be, I realize now, a sort of recollection to Orwell himself. Orwell always preferred England to Great Britain, but that when he refers to England is Great Britain. And in this way, the world presented in the nation presented in Never Let Me Go becomes allegorically precisely a figure for a larger global community. And this is what I was trying to emphasize in the link between the clone children of that novel, which then in a monument. I mean, I have to admit, I was floored by reading Wood's review or his statements about Never Let Me Go, when he utterly reverses this and makes the novel about general existential conditions of elites in the first world, about our own finitude. Because I think what Ishiguro is bringing into focus is precisely our inseparability and the contingency of global neoliberalism, especially in its most triumphant moment on hyperexploitation in other places in the globe. Something similar occurs in Klara and the Sun, and I didn't have the time to talk enough about this today, and so thank you for giving me the chance to elaborate on this a little further, in the connection between Klara and the house servant who disappears in the novel. I think what Ishiguro is signaling again is the deep dependency of the United States on global labor for the reproduction of its contemporary situation, and highlighting, I think in a brilliant fashion, the great paradox that exists in right-wing anti-immigration policies, though of course it's been said by many conservative figures that they don't want to end immigration. They just really are interested in restraining the rights of non-documented workers. These workers still will be allowed here, but they don't dare argue for unionization. They don't dare ask for health care, medical care. They don't dare ask for education. And this is what the lack of any access to these other possibilities, to be given the recognition of full dignity, and which again, and full humanity, which again takes us right back to the remains of the day, I realized, to either Klara or the house servant, or exactly in whatever positive sense Ishiguro wants to present Josie as representing some potential for the future. At least at this stage, she's quite happy to, once Klara has served her purpose, to let her live in the closet. And then when she returns home for the first time, I imagine her mother said, "Oh yeah, I sent Klara to the junkyard where she can be peacefully." And she, "Oh, okay, that's good. Klara was great." And that might be some of the last thoughts. I hope that's not possible. That would be reproductive futurity. But it's exactly the ways in which these links occur throughout Ishiguro's constriction. And in some ways, it's almost precisely by the rigorous containment of these worlds that these cracks appear, that these opening ups onto a larger global community take place. So thank you. Oh, you're silenced again, Sandra.
Sorry, I start speaking and forget about the microphone. We have 2 more questions, and I suggest that these are the last ones, because I mean, you must be tired.
I've said I'm happy and the enthusiasm of the moment, but I don't mean to keep you. I know people.
No, we don't mean to keep you, because you must have other things to do.
So not at all for me here.
So, one other question is by George. His name is really George Amaral, one of our students. He says, well, regarding the question of allegories, which formal elements in dystopias can make them more or less allegorical? How can this either favor or undermine the critical appeal of a literary work?
Very, very interesting question. Thank you. I would like to first respond to the formal element, because what science fiction is able to so successfully do is foreground formally the indispensable element of any allegorical text, which is the moment of what I describe as the allegorical trigger, the moment in the text where the link between the reader's contemporary situation and the world represented in the text becomes most evident here. I think, for example, I've talked about one such allegorical trigger in Klara and the Sun just a moment ago. The link between the housemaid Melania, and I don't think it's any coincidence that he chose the name of Donald Trump's wife for this servant as well. I think he's reminding again that she is in fact an immigrant to the United States as well, providing a certain labor in a service economy, though that's a question I want to go to here. But that it's that link between her and Klara. And I skipped actually one line late in the novel. She identifies a direct kinship with Klara. After long resisting her, she says at the end, you and I were on the same team in regard. And I think that functions as this allegorical trigger, which then allows the work to continue throughout the text. I think your second question, again, is exactly at the center of Frederick Jameson's great, most recent book, Allegory and Ideology, about the long criticism of both literary allegories and allegoresis, or allegorical interpretations, creative reading, practices of creative writing and creative reading here, as a diminished mechanical form. And it's fascinating, again, that this is exactly the distinction that Wood puts into work in his condemnation of David Mitchell's fiction and Ishiguro's The Buried Giant, and which he praises then conversely Never Let Me Go for not being. And that's for the allegory as opposed to the novel, right? And what that sense of the allegory Jameson always says is an extraordinarily restricted mechanical definition of allegory. And this was, in fact, one of the points of this final diagram, which is one of the issues I'm developing in great detail in the Jameson files, is precisely the way in our Allegory and Ideology, Jameson dramatically expands our sense of allegory and allegoresis, beginning by saying all true allegories are in fact fourfold allegories, to go back to the original classical allegorical hermeneutic here, and that this is, despite the criticisms of a closing of the text, in fact an opening up to it, to not only all kinds of interpretive possibilities. What's so exciting for Jameson, and something he's taught me and conveyed to me about allegoresis and allegory, is the simultaneity of different themes, different readings, different kinds of issues. I should say I'm not dismissing fully Wood's allegorical humanistic reading of, which is ironically, despite his own critique, is a form of an allegorical reading, which Jameson says is one of the most debased, for him, one of the most debased forms of allegorical reading. I'm not dismissing that. I think what Wood isolates there is also very at work in the text, but it is his restriction of that, to say this is the only true reading. And this is because it engages in these humanist notions. It is not an allegory in the mechanical sense. It is a novel. And it's that distinction that Jameson is utterly obliterating in his own work. And I think Ishiguro, as a writer, as an artist himself, is also obliterating here. So it not only opens up to the text to these simultaneous different kinds of investments, it opens it up to the play of the relationship between these different kinds of investments. And that kind of opening up is exactly what forces us as readers. And I think that kind of forcing is something that's so important, right? It forces us to do something different. Jameson talks about the Grimasian semiotic square, which I also reproduced in my final slide here, as the usefulness of it being not in taxonomizing a text, but in forcing us, right, to see something different. And this is what, thank you for putting it back up, this final position at the very bottom of the square. It forces me to say, if this is what Ishiguro is in fact doing, to account for the affirmative utopian aspects that Ishiguro himself, in trying to attempt to, all authors are also always involved in educating their readers how to read their own works here, that he's educating us to be aware of, to not simply read this as one more closed, despairing vision here. And so that, I think, is the importance of and the potentialities of allegorical reading. So in the sense of mechanical, simple allegories, yes, that can be a diminution of the possibilities of the text. In this larger sense of allegorical production, I think it's about an opening up and the very highest possibilities of what an artistic work can begin to achieve.
Thank you, Philip. We have one more question. It's the last one as far as I can see here. So it's already put to you in English. How far do contemporary dystopias, such as Ishiguro's, suggest a new model for the novel as a genre and deconstruct its traditional role of reaffirming the notion of the autonomous bourgeois subject?
Thank you, Andre. It's actually a
Sorry,
really
I forgot.
great.
It was Andre's question.
Yes, thank you. It's a really wonderful question, because you've got right to the heart of what I'm doing in this paper, and for those of us who will be discussing in a few months, Invoking Hope, what I'm attempting to do in that book and so much of my recent writings is to really focus on writers like Ishiguro who are challenging the narrow definitions of the novel as being exclusively a form, a Jamesian form. This is why Mark McGurl's work is so important to me too, is he really identifies, at least in the situation of the United States, the ideological function of the program era to instantiate what you're really describing here as the novel as created by Henry James, and then in the post-war moment fully institutionalized here, and the way in which this involves a reinscription of all kinds of great modernist writers, as well as engaging in this kind of practice, but always leading right in the still debates in the present. And I think maybe that's part of the core of my interest in this, a figure who is always foundational for my thinking about the novel, James Joyce, is that there are still debates, right, about Ulysses. Is this a great novel or not? Because it does not fulfill the narrow definition of the novel, as you beautifully put it, as instantiating the bourgeois subject, as in being involved. And this is what I think is key for me, is being involved in forms of reproductive futurity. This is the distinction I raised at the very beginning of the paper, that thanks to working through some of these issues has now become clearer to me, between the work of a critic who is always about reproducing these the past, reproducing these normative forms, and the scholar or truly creative writer or true artist for me, who's interested in opening up new possibilities and seeing what they enable, to experiment, right, to play games, all of these things, right, to become so important in these kinds of writers. And so Ishiguro is participating, and I had touched on this in the paper, and it's in fact going to be the topic of my undergraduate course come the fall, which is entitled Science and or Literary Fictions, that I think so many writers in the present are beginning to engage in. And for me, these are the most exciting writers in our present. And I think it's some of these writers, and I should add to my critique of the most recent Nobel Prizes, I think, in fact, most affirmatively, they've gone back to what Ishiguro calls for in his Nobel speech, the first project of diversity, bringing attention to writers who deserve to be read, who deserve to be listened to in other parts of the globe, But I think in response, these, and by what I really do believe, because of the controversies that occurred in 2018 and subsequently, that the writers who were the expected recipients in 2017, Murakami, Negugi, or Atwood, probably never will get the prize. And it's precisely because of their experiments with non-traditional novelistic forms. Negugi himself has written a beautiful utopia and dystopia novels. And it's, for all of them, this is a central part of their practice. So those are the writers I'm most interested in. Those are the writers that I think, in my responsibilities as a teacher, in my responsibilities in talking with you today, which has been an extraordinary, exhilarating experience, that I want to open up to you, to see what you can do with them. And so many of you have already showing that in the very brief time we've had in the chat. And for that, I want to thank you as well.
Thank you very much, Philip. I mean, it's been really a very, very interesting 2 hours we have spent with you. And I hope we can renew this experience soon when you offer your workshop. I suppose it's going to be perhaps a smaller audience. But anyway, I think that will give plenty of room for discussion and the exchange of ideas. So we look forward to that. And I hope it actually takes place very soon. And there's something else I would like to say, is that in spite of the all the complaints and all the sadness of the pandemic, it's actually allowed us to have this sort of interaction, the online, not face-to-face meetings and encounters. But anyway, it's something we can do, and which technology has allowed us to do. So there's always a silver lining to every situation, every let's say tragic period we are experiencing. But I mean, this is something that we have been able to do, and we thank you very much for taking your time and giving us your time, and we hope to meet you very, very soon. Thanks a lot.
Well, I want to thank you again for what really has been a wonderful opportunity for me, for forcing me to tackle something that I might have deferred for a while. That's been really extraordinary for the conversations. And I couldn't agree with you more, Sandra, is that emphasize the positive possibilities, not the negative of this. But one of the negative possibilities is one of the pleasures of meeting face-to-face and gathering from time to time is the boundaries of the formal talk open up in the conversations that continue throughout the event. I always tell my students that the most important work in a conference is never your presentations, but the people you talk to in the audience, the people you go out to dinner with. And I'd say I would be happy for especially you three, but for anyone out there listening today, I would love to consider this only a beginning of our conversation. And so send me an email if there are other questions or issues that you'd like to talk about a little further. It's P. Wegner, my name, P. Wegner, at UFL, University of Florida, at ufl.edu. I'd be happy for anyone to continue this conversation. And I hope we do get a chance to meet sometime in the future. Thank you so much.
Yes, let's hope for
you.
that. And maybe we can even think of, hopefully meet in person, right, somewhere at some point. But thank you very much. Julia, Samuel, would you like to say your last words, your final words?
Yes. Thank you so much, Philip, for sharing some of your research with us. You're so generous. You were so generous in your talk and your comments. Thank you so much. We really look forward to seeing you again, we are really looking forward to setting up this workshop, and it's going to be a pleasure to be able to discuss your new book with you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for continuing to instigate the interest in science fiction.
Yes, and I was very curious about your undergraduate course. I'm going to ask you for the program later on.
Yeah, I'll be, well, for both positive, again, what Sandra said, there are very positive reasons for this, but the motivations in our state, I will say, at the least, are less positive than for this. Our syllabi all have to be made publicly available a few weeks before the classes take place, the kind of disciplining to make sure what we're teaching here. But I, of course, would be happy to share this with you or again, or anyone. I really do consider syllabi, I consider course design a indispensable part of our creative work as scholars, and like our other creative work, like our scholarship, like our writing, like our teaching, I think there are things that are meant to be shared and communicated and talked about and experimented with. So I'm happy, again, to share that or any of my recent courses with you. Thank you.
It's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now I'm just going to switch to Portuguese very quickly, just to let our viewers know that we continue with our event in the afternoon. We have our first panel at 2:00, and in which we will have Professor Jorge de Almeida from the University of São Paulo and Andrea Seifert. I'm so sorry, I forgot her. This is so bad. I forgot her affiliation. I don't have the program here. Okay, so let me say this in Portuguese. Muito obrigada pela presença de todos, e às 2:00 a gente retoma a nossa conferência com a primeira mesa do nosso evento, com o professor Jorge de Almeida, da Universidade de São Paulo, e a professora Andrea Seifert,
da Universidade de São Paulo também.
Da Universidade de São Paulo também. Desculpa, era uma mesa uspiana e eu não decorei. Muito obrigada, gente. Obrigada, Sandra. Thank you so much for always taking part in our events and for always being so supportive.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye, guys. See you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.